Hello and welcome to Portrait of an Editor. I am Francis Lombard. In this episode, I had a great talk with Cliff Chiang, in which we discussed how his editing work at Vertigo Comics reverberates throughout his career right up to CATWOMAN Lonely City. He also dived into the creative and the somewhat laborious process he took to make Lonely City. Enjoy! Cliff, welcome to Portrait of an Editor. I'll have to say, with all my conversations with Will Dennis during our cropped episodes, I think I already know you. And they have spoken very highly of you. You seem to be the the wizard behind everything, it seems, because I was talking with Pornsack and Will when it came to Good Asian. Your name came up on that, and it's also come up on so many other things where just your insight into comics and just sort of approach to comics has, influenced others from what I've heard from Will, basically. And as I just finished, and we will be talking about CATWOMAN Lonely City a lot, but it looks like that sort of paid off. So I guess now you can leave comics behind and move on, right?
Your work is done here. That I was, influential on anybody, but that's nice to hear.
It just seems, so I just want to, the reason why you're here, because you started out as editorial. So I want to sort of, in our conversation, how does, your days at Harvard and then Vertigo, and then how does it all lead to this sort of one-man show graphic novel of CATWOMAN, Lonely City, and then the other works that you definitely have planned. For listeners, let's just start off. I mean, one thing I came and researched that you got into comics pretty good, just before you hit high school or stuff. And what I heard that you were saying that you read for 4 years, there was you really read them intensely. And then like everybody else, usually, things drop off, high school comes around and just growing up and other things. And, we're, back in the day when you read comics in high school, you were sort of, still, it wasn't accepted as it is today, really. You were sort of seen as the outsider or weirdo or nerd or whatever. What was your love for comics that, started this all? Where did that sort of set you up?
Yeah, I started reading them when I was 10.
Yeah.
My older brother had brought them home. I always knew about comics, but we didn't really have any around the house until then. And he brought back Fantastic Four and X-Men. This is like 1984. So it's John Byrne and Paul Smith, and immediately I had always drawn and loved cartoons and Peanuts, and was always drawing. So it really spoke to me. And the way, those comics were written, they pull you into this universe, and, with all these references to other books and storylines that you haven't read. And so it's really fertile ground for, for a 10-year-old, and it kind of blows your mind at how expansive it is. So I just fell into it, and that kind of graphic storytelling I hadn't seen, really, beyond comic strips, more than 4 panels, to see things play out in that way, I think was really, I didn't think about it intellectually at the time, but it really was this kind of advancement for me, to see that happen on the page. And so I loved it and read them for years. And then I think it was probably around when the direct market happened, it became a lot harder for me to get comics because as I got more interested in them, I wanted to make sure I got every issue, but then, not every issue would show up or would sell out at the local drugstore,
Yeah, I used to drive my local, there was 2 drugstores in town, and I would drive. Got to the point I started driving that person crazy with the magazines.
Yeah.
And I would be there on whatever Tuesday, and I'm like, can you open that? Can you snip those open right now? Because I want to get that issue and stuff.
Yeah, and as great as, the way the direct market solved a lot of those problems, I didn't know of a local shop, that was close by. So the nearest one was, 20 minutes away at the mall, which meant, having to, beg my parents to take me there. And then, then there's like money. It's like suddenly I think comics were starting to get more expensive too, went from 60 cents to 75 or $1 or whatever. I think I just kind of fell out of it. Then high school happened, and so it was just occasionally I would read them if friends had them, but it just became too hard to keep it up as a hobby. So it wasn't until college that I had, the free time and there was so much comics available in Cambridge. Being a college town, there was at least three great comic shops. Within 2 blocks of each other, really. So it was really easy to get back into it. And at that point, I started reading the Vertigo material, and it blew my mind that there was this other, this whole other approach to genre fiction, with an eye towards appealing to adults, or just more, mature readers, I guess, and it spoke to me, I started reading Sandman, and, I was an English major, and it just, that just dovetails when you're, 18. It works out really well. And I just became obsessed with it again. And I had wanted to.
I got a question for you.
Yep.
When you dropped off, when it became difficult to get comics, did you, and at 14 you start, going to movies by yourself and stuff, or reading novels, did you start discovering other genres? Because when it comes to Vertigo especially, you're talking probably the 90s or something, they were moving into, they were in other genres. That was a thing about taking into others. Did you start becoming familiar with other genres, and that the appeal of Vertigo was something like that? I know these from novels, I know these from TV or film.
I think, my experience of comics up till college was just as superhero fair. And then so seeing Vertigo and and independent comics, really seemed much more diverse story wise. So, it was just definitely more interesting, as superheroes were, only in comic books at that point. So anything else that I watched, of course I was, there was crime, and, this is like when, Pulp Fiction is coming out, like that sort of thing. Movies, what I was interested in becoming a filmmaker, just as, for storytelling reasons. And then when I fell back into comics, I realized, well, maybe this is the medium for me, and, so comics became, I think that's when it became a medium for me, and not just this, place for superhero genre fiction.
Were you still drawing even?
I kept drawing throughout like high school, but, and then when I got to college, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, so I was an English major, and then, the guys who became my roommates in college, like they were also picking up comics, stuff from Dark Horse and Image, and it got me drawing that stuff again. It got me more interested in drawing comics, and then by the next year, I had to really settle down on a major, and and then I realized I wasn't doing any art, so I should, so I decided to do English and visual art.
And how, we're talking Harvard, so what's that experience like? Was that just a exposure, or was there something that really pushed you when you study English, you're studying English, you're not, is there a creative writing element there, or was the creative aspect in the art?
There could have been. I didn't follow any of that up. I don't know. I think part of it was just being just not being confident enough to want to, but there were certainly creative writing classes and courses, and then with the art, they were always very quick to say that they were not a professional school, but that they were trying to teach more about the theory and practice of art, which is fine. So it just kind of makes you kind of take like almost a higher level view of things, as opposed to just really getting down and dirty with with certain things. So like I took a design course, but we didn't learn any of the software. It was just, moving things around with, with paper and letraset and stuff like that. But in the 90s, so
when it came to English, were you just more studying and how to, discussing what was working on the page and, looking at story, getting familiar with storytelling?
I think, I think when you're an English major, you do have to be able to discuss literary criticism. And in a way, that stuff always seemed, I was much more interested in kind of what I assumed the author's intentions were and whether they were able to land, to achieve them on the page. So much more a practitioner's point of view. And, so I had a, it was hard for me to really engage with theory and criticism because they almost seemed like an end to itself, to my mind, not engaging with what was important to me about literature.
I mean, what do you feel about your experience with, pursuing a degree in English? When you're removed from it to this point, did those frustrations and also just the experience of it, does it work for you now? Do you, did it help develop you, especially as you moved into editing and now as a writer yourself? Do you look back at that experience and go, even though it could have been frustrating or you were expected to read books that you just could not get through? I'm an English major too. So I'm just asking, every time I look back at that experience as an English major, why did I go down that path and how has it helped me?
Yeah. I mean, in a very simplistic way, I thought, hey, I like reading. I'll be an English major,
Oh, I can get through college easily.
Yeah. And, but I wasn't really prepared for kind of the academic rigor of it. And that maybe not prepared, but just not as interested in that side of it. That made it difficult, and it made me realize that maybe I didn't want to just do that for college. But looking back on it, I definitely feel like it has a value. Being able to look at writing through a couple different lenses, I think is always helpful. You can kind of look at it, just on a story level, plot and this and that, and then try and just take a step back and see it, how it relates to, things. Or is it, are you trying to make a point? Are you trying to or are you just trying to tell a story? What are you, just trying to grapple with the text a little bit more, I think is worth doing and probably not done enough in most media.
So you're reading Salmon in your dorm room in Cambridge. How do you make the jump to being an editor at Vertigo?
Yeah, I mean, that was the dream, right? I think when I was leaving school, one year I managed to intern with Marvel, which was great. I kind of learned how they do things, and you kind of get all the grunt work, but you get to see how the office runs, and that was really helpful. I worked with Joey Cavalieri while he was at Marvel, and then a couple years later, when I graduated, I reached out to him, and he put me in touch with Heidi McDonald, and she was doing the comic section for Disney Adventures Comics, and I helped her out as an assistant there, getting this comic section together and managing a couple different features and creative teams, for 2-page, 4-page, 8-page segments. And that was a great education into how comics publishing works, into deadlines, into deadline management, and managing freelancers. After I did that for about a year, and then there was an opening at Vertigo, which was it was so difficult at the time, and I think it kind of always has been, to break into editorial. There's not a lot of positions.
No.
It tends to be by attrition, and either people, move up, move on, or sadly, pass away. And, it happened that, there was an opening. I interviewed for it, did not get it, but my my wife, who's now my wife, she got that position, and then 6 months later, another position opened up at Vertigo. So it's really fortuitous, but I just never expected that, to be able to work at Vertigo. It was such an important touchstone for me in terms of my comics reading, and the dream was always to work there or work somewhere similar. At this point, I wanted to make comics, but there was no guarantee that I would become a penciler or an artist, or that it would be good enough. So making comics, whatever form it takes, if that meant I was going to be an editor, then I wanted to be an editor. So it was, by whatever means necessary.
One thing I discovered is that, like at Marvel, going through the internship and being familiar with how the office is run and the workload, because I actually, the French office that I worked for with Humanoids was probably a lot more laid back, and we're producing one book a year for every series. If you're lucky if you get two. But did it help being an intern at Marvel just to understand the workload? And what was the differences between coming from the Marvel office to the Vertigo office? Was there just in workload?
Well, as an intern, I don't think I was quite privy to really understanding, what the workload was like. I think both places remind me of like newsrooms. I think, there's always every week there's a book that has to be sent to the printer, so there's just constant deadlines. And, once you understand that, the places are very similar. You're just dealing with different talent and different story considerations. One of the nice things about Vertigo was that because of the focus on story and then on creator-owned properties, you're dealing with talent on a different in a different way than if you're doing corporate IP. If it's Batman or Catwoman or whatever, the company is definitely going to have a stronger say in what you can and cannot do, and that isn't necessarily negotiable. But then when it's a creator owned, if it's Preacher and Garth has written something, and then they're worried about how it might play or whatever, that has to be a conversation. It's a more gentle conversation, or and they're also very respectful of that author's voice and what their vision for the series is. So I felt like having that, I feel like that's much more where the industry is these days, compared to, say, 80s Jim Shooter Marvel, where the editors are really calling the shots on so much stuff, so that I think thinking about comics in that way has always been important to me, because it values the comic itself as an artistic expression and not just as a way to sell toys.
Well, I mean, going back to what we just first started talking about, I mean, do you feel when you first fell in love with comics with John Byrne, Paul Smith, the Chris Claremont era, when you started reading when your brother was bringing them home, do you feel there were artistic expressions there? Because that is, Shooter overlording over these books, and still you have books that, if you've ever listened to anything that Will and I talk about, the John Byrne resonates even 30 years later, 40 years later. Yeah. Do you feel it's just a different kind of expression that these guys managed to get there? When you think back, do you feel that it was just I'm trying to create the question, but compared to a Garth Ennis Preacher, compared to a John Byrne Fantastic Four, is it just a different landscape for those creators, and yet their point of view gets across?
Yeah, I think that's it can't help but come across, and I think those comics, because they were largely done Marvel method too, or a little bit looser, certainly not as full script as DC was at the time. I think there's much more input from the artist and in how things are paced and that results in a comic that feels different. And there's something really visually engaging beyond just, hey, that's an exciting pose or something like that. There's a pacing to it that is specific to comics, that leverages the strengths of comics as opposed to just being, a storybook.
I didn't really want to jump into Catwoman Lonely City right now, but now that I'm thinking about it, is that John Byrne's Fantastic Four, when he was on it, he was not only writing and penciling, he was inking, and I think there was even times when he lettered. And now here you are, in 2022, delivering a book that's basically doing the same thing, where that kind of creativity and playing in a sandbox where you were acknowledging a lot of things that came before. I mean, that was one thing when I just reread The Lonely City and just was reading some reviews of just all the things you managed from all those universes and all the history of Catwoman that you managed to get in there, and Byrne's doing the same thing. I don't know if there's a connection there. Maybe you can tell me if there is.
It's, I think it's funny when I think back on reading comics, as a 10-year-old, I don't know if I ever really considered it as a possible career for me. But, it is, some of the first Fantastic Four comics I read were like the Trial of Reed Richards, right? And Byrne inserts himself in that story. I always love that Marvel Comics exist in Marvel Comics, but Byrne shows up and goes on an adventure to Galactus's trial, or Reed Richards' trial, and so there's an awareness that somebody is making this stuff, and I didn't realize then how much work it was, but it is interesting to think that like one of these comics that so early on was done, has this kind of auteur voice to it.
And then, here you are now. So, but let's get back to your timeline as an editor. I've asked this question a number of editors when they get jobs, on that, is that the process of getting a job, as you were saying earlier, it's really tough. There's not a lot of them to get into editorialship. Did they really put you through a lot of, question and answers, and how did they test your skills, or what was the interview process? Because I've heard things where it's taken months and they want you to break down a script. They also want to, they're asking about, other technical aspects. Or I think Will's told me that he basically did an interview a few times, and because he knew somebody and they were, Shelley Bond, I think they were looking to hire somebody, and he's like, this is okay, I can come to that, I know comics, and go from there. And it sounds very simple.
It's my leaving DC Vertigo that opened up a spot, and that's the job that Will got, actually.
Okay.
Which is
wow,
funny.
It all comes together now.
Yeah.
I did not know that. Okay.
See, Will had to fill the giant gaping hole that I left. Stuart Moore was the one who interviewed me, because he had interviewed me 6 months earlier for the other position.
Jennifer
came back to me, and and that was great. So I had a couple rounds of interviews, maybe one with him, and then one with Karen Berger as the final one, to just make sure I wasn't, that I knew what I was talking about. I think, having, an English degree from an Ivy League, it just kind of gives you some, you're in, you're past the gate already. And, to be able to talk at least somewhat, about story and about writing, I think those things helped. But there wasn't a test per se. Not that I remember. I can't, there wasn't like, hey, here's a script and here's some pages, can you balloon them, kind of thing. You just end up learning that stuff on the job. I think because I had also the editorial experience already with Heidi, then they knew I could kind of just jump into the job without too much, training.
Was Heidi in Burbank at that point, or was it still run
No,
out of New
she was in
York?
New York. Yeah.
Okay, and they were running it out of New York for.
Yeah, Disney had an office in New York.
Oh, okay. So, and then you learned ballooning there, and et cetera. Just the sort of the skills of getting a book together for shipping out.
The assistant editor stuff, so making sure there are copies when the art comes in. There's a lot of, assistant editors are so, like, their job is 90%, I think, logistics. And then slowly on the edges, you learn these other higher level skills about, plotting and pacing and talking with talent. And, that these are, but it's not so much of, at least, the way we did it, the editor really relies on you to do that sort of work so that they can be freed up to read and scripts and edit scripts. Otherwise, when is there time to do that stuff if you're, too busy chasing down, pages and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Is there something that you really like doing as an assistant editor? Was there some, that maybe as an editor you miss doing?
My favorite part was talking with creators whose work I loved and getting insights from them on the craft. I was still very interested in becoming a professional artist when I was there. So whatever I could glean from them, from these phone conversations, checking in weekly, how's the deadline? Where's the script? Where's the pages? Where are the pages? But then, you can't just call and ask, where's the work? You're having a conversation with them. And then at the end, where is it? But those conversations were really great, and everyone was so supportive. So those are my fondest memories of working there, but there are a lot of little things, just that took me through almost like a boot camp of sorts in terms of making comics. Just the sheer number of pages that would come in and need to be ballooned and sent out to letterers, and you're comparing them against script. So you're constantly seeing what the script called for, how the artist interpreted it, and then you're weighing that on, like, well, what's the final effect? Are you getting what the writer asked for? Is it okay that you're not getting what the writer asked for? Is it better, or is it just different? And then if it's wrong, how do you fix it? And at that point, usually it's so much work to redraw stuff. That's sort of the last, resort. So you're trying to just do this kind of field medicine on a page. Like, what if we move this, balloon over here, or we change this dialogue a little bit? Will that make this panel work better? Or make this moment land better? And doing that week after week gives you a different kind of fluency in the language of comics, because you're constantly seeing what happens if I change this tiny thing. And, without that, I don't, it very quickly built up for me, fluency in visual storytelling.
Are you literally almost at points counting the number of words in every dialogue line to see if it works for a balloon? I mean, are you getting,
No, that's more just,
okay,
a gut thing. But definitely when sometimes, it might get away from you, and then you have this giant balloon and you're like, I need to trim this, because it doesn't, because a huge balloon like that takes away from the immediacy of the panel, and I think when you lose that, you have to do that very deliberately. It can't just be because you were a little too wordy that day.
And were there tricks that you picked up along the line to sort of help you sort of just get through that? Was there any sort of that you learned from Heidi as you were going through, as an assistant editor? What were some of the things that you allow, that people don't know that they're reading, that allow you to just get through that and get the page onto the next stage? Or is it just really down to gut reactions and looking, every page is a different puzzle, I guess?
Yeah, I do think that, it is a different puzzle each and every time, and each scene calls for something different, or might call for something different. But over time, you do recognize the patterns. So that experience was really valuable for me. But I think maybe what I learned is most important that was most important for me as a penciler was making sure that you leave room for lettering, and if you do your own ballooning, um, that pacing is so important. It's so important to whether you look competent as a storyteller. So if you're able to present ballooning, it makes the assistant editor's job a lot easier. It preserves the storytelling style that you want, and that will become associated with you. If you're adding a silent panel, you have to show you want to make it clear. Otherwise, suddenly there's 8 panels on this 6-panel page. Why is that? So you have to explain that to your editor, and by being able to show balloon placements, then you can, they can read along with it and see how you've adapted the storytelling, or refined it in some ways. Not enough people do it, I think. Just trusting that they're going to stick with the script. But what happens when you combine, these 2 panels, because it's just 2 characters talking to each other without a significant beat, to give yourself space for something more important, a panel or 2 later. Those are important things. And those are things that I feel like you can learn more easily through, going through a volume of pages.
So when did you actually start at Vertigo? You got hired what year?
I think it was end of 97.
97. Okay.
Yeah.
What was your first day like, if you remember it? Or I don't know, if maybe you've blocked it from your memory. I don't know. And you were hired as an editor, right?
As an assistant editor.
As an assistant editor.
Yeah, I actually never made it to editor.
Okay. Because I know in 03, so 6 years later, you're drawing Beware the Creeper.
Right.
That's when I became aware of your stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I was on staff for 2 years.
So 2 years, okay.
Yeah, and left at the end of 99.
So you were working under who?
I was working under Stuart Moore and Axel Lonzo, and then the last few months I was working with Shelley Bond.
As an assistant editor, compared to your job with Heidi, what were the changes, or what was the difference? I mean,
mostly volume. When it's really great to work on shorter pieces because you get a feel for structure. But then when you're talking to Peter Gross about initial Books of Magic, that's 22 pages. It's a different volume of stuff, and making sure that all the pieces for that come in at the right time, and that you're trafficking the pages to the right people and keeping everybody moving. That was a big part of the job, the traffic cop part of it, and it shouldn't be underestimated. It might not be creative necessarily, but the project management is kind of where the schedule lives and dies.
And you're talking 97, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a crop that I just recorded and I'll have out before this, Will and I also were talking about at that time, and I was getting really back into comics. People were talking about the industry. We might not be here for a month.
Yes.
What was, I remember reading stuff, Warren Ellis talking about, American comics are done in 2 months, done in this. What were you thinking back then? Were you thinking people just don't get it? We're going to bounce back. Marvel, of course, is coming out of bankruptcy and stuff like that. What was the vibe at Vertigo then?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I was industry-wise that savvy about what was happening. I mean, as aware as I was, it was probably 96, right, when things went really upside down.
Yeah.
With comics. So this was coming out of that, and things were starting to get better, although Marvel was starting to get really dire for them. I know now how dangerous a time that would have been for comics, but at the time, at DC, I was just thinking, well, this is just, competition or whatever. Like, if I hadn't really thought about what would happen if they really went out of business, and how disastrous that would be. So I don't think I was as nervous as I should have been.
So you get the job and you're there for 2 years. And you, as you just said, you were like, well, if I'm going to get into comics, and here's the opportunity to be in comics as an editor.
Yeah.
But it sounds like in other things you've said that you were pursuing, you were getting back into drawing. You were drawing because
I was working on my art at the same time and trying to get short jobs. And the good thing about being on staff was that I got to know the editors and they got to know me, and I would show them samples, and get real feedback. Like it was like going to a convention and having a portfolio review, and it helped me get just short things here and there just to work on my chops.
How do you negotiate the politics of that? Because you're here
gently.
Yeah, I was going to say, because
gently. Yeah, you have to. These were editors that I had a relationship with already, that I was friendly with already. It was not the first day that I started showing pages around.
Okay.
It took 6 months to a year. Because one, I didn't have the time, to be drawing stuff, and I was just working on the craft on my own, as well. So, just trying to do self-published little things, and when you reach a point that you feel like, oh, I can show this around, or I've gotten a portfolio ready, that doesn't happen overnight. So,
But you felt after 6 months that was fine, because I've always wondered about when do I, because an old agent of mine said, call them, because that's their job, is to have writers or whatever hitting them up for jobs. But I'm like, and they're like, it's a known thing, don't be scared of it. But when you're working with these folks and you're supposed, you're busy already with your job. I was just wondering, when did you feel it was, after 6 months, was there a conversation you had with somebody? They're like, okay, I can feel fine doing this, because there is that, they're your boss and they're busy too.
Right. I think, over the course of working there, you become friendly with people and you have conversations about the comics that you love, and you find editors, friends who are inclined similarly, and then you realize, this, and they might have creative, aspirations themselves. And, and the interesting thing about DC at the time, it was very much church and state. If you were working on staff, it was very difficult to get work, freelance work.
I've heard that too. Yeah.
Approved by your superiors, and then it had to go all the way up to Paul Levitz and get signed off on. So,
wow. Okay.
Which meant that if you were going to be offered something, it was this extra level of hassle, and that they didn't, they wanted to keep, jobs from just going to other editors, which totally makes a lot of sense. And, for me, there were a couple jobs, and then, just short things, which were very easy to get, approved. Things like in the Big Book series that Andy Helfer and was his department was doing. So it and my friend Jim Higgins was editing some of those too, and so he reached out and said, hey, we've got 2 pages of this. Are you interested? So there would be short pieces, no longer than a couple pages. But then as my art got better and I was talking to the editors more, then it was like, oh, well, we've got this single issue or something like that, and, I remember, talking to Pete Tomasi, right, who, was editing, a bunch of great books there at the time, but also wanted to be writing comics, and doing film. So, we got along really well, and he liked my art and, suggested me for one of the Fifth Week events, which would give me time, because also working full time as an assistant editor only gives you from, 8 or 9 p.m. till the next day, to work on art. So anything that I did would require a longer timeline, because I wasn't available to draw during the day. So it became it got to a point where I realized that if I wanted to be a professional artist, that I had to do it full time. I had to pursue it full time, whether or not I had anything, lined up. And it was interesting. I remember speaking to Axel Alonso, and he mentioned this comes up fairly often, because there are, a lot of editors do wonder, or they're asked, do you want to write or do you want to draw? So Axel had a conversation with Archie Goodwin. How do you handle it? And Archie's response was, if you're going to edit, you can't ever want to be on the other side of the desk. You have to be okay with that, because otherwise you can't want that more than you want to edit, because it'll kind of bleed into your editing work, and it's not about how you would do something. It's about shepherding someone through the process.
Interesting. I mean, I think Archie is, as people say, he's one of the best editors and most influential editors even to today.
And a great writer.
Because I just finished reading that book about Warren Publishing, Empire of Monsters. And Archie was editing and writing a lot of books.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to find out when he took that upon himself. That philosophy.
I don't think it's that he separated them necessarily, but you can't want to be a writer more. You can't let that desire color your editing work.
Yeah, I see.
And I think if you want that more than you want to be an editor, then that can be a problem. And for me, it was, I thought that was really interesting, and I had to think, which did I want more? And and that's when it came down to, well, if I'm ever going to make it as a professional artist, then I was going to have to dedicate myself to it more.
So you wanted that more.
Yeah.
After 2 years as an assistant editor working, probably 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
Basically, you realized I still want to be in comics, but not as an editor and not that spot in comics.
Yeah.
How planned out were you on making the change, or did you just sort of leap into the deep end of the pool?
I didn't have a lot of work lined up. I was able to move home, which meant not having to worry about rent in New York City. So I could just work on drawing and whatever jobs came in, and I did that for a few years, 2 or 3 years. And it wasn't.
You left in 97, right?
I left in 99.
99. You left. You started in 97, left in 99, and then spent the next couple of years just
working on whatever came
my
way. And it was initially an issue here and there, and then the more regular work happened when I started doing backup stories with Matt Adelson in Detective Comics, the Josie Mack stuff with Judd Winnick.
Yeah.
I became, I knew Bob Schreck and Matt Adelson from working there, and started doing these backups, and that was great because it was 8 pages on a monthly basis, and so kind of like an easier, manageable schedule. I could spend the time that I needed to, because you're slower, you're trying to get things right. So that was perfect. It was a perfect training ground for me.
How much of a deadline do they give you an 8-page story?
I mean, it needed the comic was coming out every month, so it was so probably about 3 weeks is probably what I had to do it in, and then take a little bit of a break.
Was there ever a point that you thought that, oh shoot, maybe I shouldn't have quit my day job? Or were things just were they simmering enough that you're like, okay, it's working for me? Or did you have any regrets, I guess?
Not regrets, because it was always just trying to climb.
Yeah.
Regrets maybe like, my first, doing my taxes, that first year, the earned income credit, being in that zone was sort of an eye opener.
Officially a starving artist, really.
Yeah, right. I worried, but then but there was enough happening that I felt confident enough that I could keep pursuing it.
How did Beware the Creeper come about? Because I really like that. It took me a while to just buy the stuff off the stands, but there were like issues. I think around issue 4, I started grabbing it, and there was 1, 2, and 3 still available sitting on the stand. So I just grabbed it, and I thought it was gorgeous looking book, a little bit weird, but it's the Creeper, a different take on the Creeper. But was that your first full comic book, monthly comic book? I know it was only a mini series of 6 issues, but on that kind of deadline.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, it's great that it was a miniseries because we could develop it over a longer period of time without the pressure of it having to come out. Will Dennis had reached out to me because he had been talking to Jason Hall, the writer, about like the Pistol Whip books, and then he had pitched him something and it didn't work out. But I was very friendly with Will at that point. We were one of the things that I made a point to do when I was once I had left DC was come back in to see my friends at the office, and so we'd go out for Chinese food every Thursday and just shoot the shit. But and the way comics works, there are often jobs that come your way because somebody dropped the ball, didn't get pages in, we need 3 or 4 pages here, or and you needed to be in person to pick up that kind of stuff. But Will and I wanted to work together, and when he started talking to Jason, this is when they were trying to, I guess, do new takes on some of the properties. So this is when The Losers came out. This is when Wintermen was being developed.
And that was The Losers. I know Will edited too.
Yes.
He also edited Wintermen?
Yes, yep. That's right.
Okay.
And because they had success with things like Unknown Soldier, right, and El Diablo, and there were a bunch of things, just trying to find ways of rebooting, remixing some of these other properties that have been languishing, because there was still this separation of you can't do Batman in Vertigo, but you could do the Creeper, because it had been lying fallow for a few years, and so there was a list, I think, of characters, of things that were available to us. We picked the Creeper and then went with, and then developed this really, I think, unconventional take on the Creeper. And it was, I'm so fond of that project because Will trusted me. He trusted me to kind of art direct it. And it was the first time I got to really express a lot of, these things that I've always wanted to do in comics and do on the covers, and to present the book in a certain way that made it, I never wanted it to feel like a standard superhero comic, So, I'm so grateful for that, because without that book, I wouldn't have had the confidence to do that later on other books. And I think it also made that book stand out.
Yeah, I remember the covers. I was looking through just how they were designed. They did pop, and just, I don't know, there's something about green and yellow too in comics that work really well. But even just, there's something, it's been been some time since I looked at the interior of the book. I don't even know if I have it anymore because of my moving, but just how I don't know, the reds that you were using at times in the book, and just, there was a sort of a texture that you brought to it, to the artwork.
Dave Stewart.
Okay,
of course, right? It's going to be great.
But you were talking with him and setting it up for him to be able to pull this off.
I had seen Dave's work. This is pre-Hellboy, and I had seen Dave's work on over Javier Pulido, and really loved it, and and really wanted to work with him, and we were able to work on, I think, Golden Streets of Gotham together. But I had less input on that book, but then with Where the Creeper, it was like, this is a new project. It doesn't, let's let's talk about it, talk it through, and see what ideas we had. And the way he colored it, he essentially painted so much of that book. Like it wasn't a lot of kind of animation inspired, hard cuts on the coloring. It was something that was a little bit more impressionistic, and painterly, and I loved that, and it definitely elevated the book.
Now, was this approach discussed before you got into it? So you were able and was that discussed before his approach? How you were going to approach that?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, having seen what he had done, before too, was like, not, because he was also working in a few different styles at the time. He could do like a really slick superhero thing if you wanted him to, but we were definitely looking for something that was not conventional.
And how did it influence your approach to the book?
It was just overall, just knowing that it was going to look good, and they would let me try different things, so it was just kind of, and because I was, talking to Dave and talking with John Workman, who lettered the book, like establishing, with this new book, what the style guide was going to be essentially, so having all that input there was really rewarding for me and valuable for me, because again, you could present a book in a way that was a little different from other stuff that was coming out at the time, and that it really is about kind of putting your stamp on things.
Mm-hmm. Now I got to get you out in like 15 minutes, so I think I'm going to jump forward to the present time, where
keep talking. Yeah.
But I just want to. So how does all this, the developing and experience, and you've been, you went on to Wonder Woman 2, and then also Paper Girls, those long, very successful runs. But what did you, I guess, your 2 years as an assistant editor, how has that influenced the last 20 years of you as a creator?
I think it's let me have a fluency in the workflow that most artists don't have. Most of the times you're just familiar with your end of it, and you don't see how it affects other people. And when you don't see how it affects other people, you're not as aware of how it reflects on your work, what it does to the schedule. I mean, very literally on Paper Girls, that experience helped me schedule everybody, and we were never late. And I made a calendar when we started Paper Girls, and we hit all those deadlines over the course of 3 years. We never missed it. And that's, a lot of making sure that pages come in and that someone's working while, that Jared is working on lettering while Matt's coloring stuff, and making sure that it all comes in at the same time. So, and that's a huge part of it. When you're doing independent comics, you're a business owner and you have to run that business.
Yeah.
You can't just say, I'm just going to draw this, somebody else take care of it.
So even at that level, when you're working with Image, they just don't have the manpower to provide, their A-list creators.
They can do it, but
you took it on yourself.
Because as the artist, I'm generally going to be the weak link in terms of the schedule. Things are going to take longer. It just takes longer to draw the stuff. So if there's any problems, they accumulate, and they accumulate at that stage, and then there's a waterfall effect when the colorist doesn't have enough time, or the letterer doesn't have enough time. So trying to avoid all those problems, it makes everything run smoother. If you're pushing everybody to their limit, and then when something slips, it's disastrous. So you want to make sure everyone's working comfortably at like 80%.
So you built in time in Paper Girls when you started doing the schedule, because of those, your background, you were able to build in sort of contingency time and periods and how does that, I mean, it goes back to editing, but did that take a little pressure off of you, knowing that you had a schedule like this, everybody seemed to be in agreement with it, and that you had also had time worked in for people. So did it allow your creativity as an artist to really take off?
It's not something I thought about actively, but knowing that the schedule is there and that it works, especially after like the first year or so, when those dates, prove to work for everybody. It's just one less thing to worry about, and that's always good.
With Catwoman, you did everything basically except for editing. So did you have to, were you able to sort of back off a bit, or what was your editors, working with an editor like for that one? It seems.
Yeah, it's I worked with Chris Conroy and Andrea Shea on Catwoman and Lonely City, and they were great. I absolutely feel that editors are always necessary because you do have blind spots. And as much as I tried to give them something that felt pretty polished, I wrote full scripts. I sent them an outline ahead of time. I wrote the whole thing before I started drawing it, and so that they could evaluate it, and I wrote it as a full script because that's the best for me, it's the best way for an editor to kind of see it in their head, and then once it was written, I thumbnailed and lettered it so that it was a very rough version of the comic, so that we could then evaluate it as a comic and not just this blueprint for a comic, and so even if the drawings weren't finished, you could say, well, this moment feels off, this dialogue we should change. I tried to make it the tightest thing I could so that, it wouldn't involve a lot of work to fix later. Wanted to make sure that all the beats made sense. The plot, we worked through a beat sheet after the outline to make sure that everything lined up story-wise, and that there weren't questions about, like, is this scene necessary, or maybe we should move this here, or there's not enough urgency here, we need to push things. That kind of planning you don't often have the luxury to do, but it helped make Catwoman, what the kind of book that I wanted it to be. This very deliberate and considered piece of work.
Was that approach that kind of approach something you've done before, but you just developed it more, or did you feel because of what you wanted to achieve with Catwoman, you had to go at this like that?
It's more like Voltron. I think these were things that I liked in other projects to various degrees. So I liked when, writer A did this, so I'm going to take that, and then, so putting it all together was very theoretical in some ways, and it wasn't until, the first issue was done that it was like, okay, all these gambles paid off, but they were rational, experienced gambles, knowing that I could do this, but would it gel together as a book, or would it be this kind of chaotic mess?
Did you back off at all with this sort of approach as you moved forward into the series, or did you stay, I guess, as rigid with full scripts and
no, there was no backing off, because it was all written at once.
All written at once. Okay.
Yeah, it was all drawn at once. So there was which made it really challenging, because it's really this long haul where, like, it's written, took me, about 6 months to write it. And then I figured it was going to take maybe another year to draw, but then it ended up taking 2, because of the size of the pages and the kind of density of information that I wanted in each panel. That pacing is so different from a lot of the other comics that I've worked on, and more directly kind of an homage to 80s DC comics and the level of density that they had. When you look at something like Dark Knight Returns, or or Year One, for example, like, those are very dense books, but they don't always read that way. But there's a lot of information being given.
Yeah, they don't, because I read Catwoman pretty much the first time. Once I finally got it, I got the collected hardcover. Thank you for that really interesting direct market cover that was awesome. The fold out and just everything.
Yeah, that was their idea. That was pretty great.
And I started rereading it again for this and prepping for this, and I reread it again. I'm like, wow, okay, I'm missing stuff. I missed that. I see this now. I didn't get through all of it, but I'm going to finish it tonight because now I see exactly what you said. There's so many layers to this that it deserves a second or third read. Again,
yeah, you want it to be, I think, almost breezy in some ways. You know, you don't want a reader to constantly be stopping, in order to get what they need out of the story. So, but on a slower read, you want that stuff to be there. There's a sense of it being there when you're reading it quickly, and then when you slow down, you can appreciate it a little bit more. But I don't think you want to load it down with being. It's hard because I think there are benefits to being more upfront and obvious about things. Mm-hmm. But I tried to background a lot of things just so that they wouldn't take away from the immediacy of the story, because something like that can be very ponderous too. Mm-hmm. I mean, I read plenty of comics that try to deal with this kind of thing or reference a lot of history, and it's like it's there if you know it. If you don't know it, it's fine, but if you get the sense of it, that's actually more important than anything else.
It feels like it goes back to your talk about all the layers that and the universes when you first started reading comics. Mm. But also, you said you were looking at film as a career too, and you were studying that. And with filmmaking, you can watch it in a theater once, and then you come back to these movies. Movies are made to be watched more than once because of all the crews that are involved in it and all the departments doing their job at especially classic movies that survive the test of time. You always come out with a different experience. There's plenty of movies I've seen more than once and numerous times, and I come out with a different experience either by the performance or what's going on in the in the background, mise en scene, or just the photography. And what you're accomplished in this is something similar to that, where you acknowledge the history of comics. I'm not a big Catwoman fan, but the first thing I thought about is Darwin Cook's, Selina's Big Score. That reminded me, that's probably, of that when I started reading yours, but also just the layers and just the look and being able, your auteurship approach to this, because you basically were an auteur on this comic. But yeah, there's so many layers going on in this. I'm not trying to, it's just a medium copying film. No, you can do this and have a really engaging read in different layers, in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a way when you're making it that you're always trying to find ways to make it richer. It's not necessarily detail, but there's a lot of story elements or a lot of choices that are very deliberate. And I think when a reader is going through the story, is reading it, when they see something, they make an assumption that you meant to put that in there. Maybe you didn't, but for the most part, I want to reward that level of close reading with an equal, passion for, getting as much character and history in there, because it just makes it a different experience. We want to keep it from being just a surface.
In filmmaking, there's these happy mistakes. Now, you, as the process you went through, and it's, from writing all the way up to the lettering and coloring it, and just how you wrote out full scripts. But during the 2-year process of drawing it, were there happy mistakes too, like what filmmakers like to find in their film too? Did you come across any of those?
Yeah, and those were actually more editing things where, the way I went back. There were definitely pages that were rescripted and redrawn, from a thumbnail to better address things that were happening. As I was, started drawing, that's when the pandemic started, and then the protests around George Floyd's murder these were things that needed to be thought of and incorporated in ways that weren't cheap. Issues around police brutality, these were, things that I wanted the comic to be in conversation with, and that required rewriting parts of it. Certain pages, certain scenes, to change the emphasis or to be more explicit about things. Those are absolutely, maybe they're not accidents, but a note from the editor then changed. There's one page that probably went through 3 or 4 different drafts over the course of several months. I did one version of it and then left it, and then 6 months, a few months later, I came back and said that felt wrong. Let's do this, and then reconfiguring it another way again by the end, when I actually had to turn the book in. With all the planning that went on, it was also important to stay agile, to be nimble, and if things needed to change them. Hopefully we caught most of those things at an earlier stage so that I wasn't having to change fully drawn pages.
How did COVID affect the drawing of the book?
That definitely slowed me down. It was right as I was beginning to draw, it was when I was thumbnailing and writing, I think, maybe. So it definitely slowed me down on top of everything else. But at the same time, it was also it was an anchor. It was something that was steady for me and that I could go back to, that I could do day in and day out, in spite of the kind of weird Groundhog Day effect of lockdown. So, I was grateful for it, but, it's also, it was definitely a challenge. Like, it was a marathon.
Yeah.
And usually I'm used to the shorter race of a monthly comic where you get it out, and then there's at least some relief. If it's the first issue of a 5-issue arc, at least you're done. You can put that one away. You don't have to keep it in your head anymore. Mm-hmm. But then with this, it was just constantly having 200 pages of story in your brain and thinking, well, if I change this panel, how does that affect everything else?
Yeah.
And that's exhausting, but that work has to be done, or else you just end up with this kind of really fluffy, thing that doesn't hold together.
So in my conversations regarding Black Label and just the birth of it, and with other editors, there is a freedom there. And what do you think of the Black Label experience for you?
Yeah,
because of the challenges.
Yeah, I'm grateful for their approach. I'm grateful that they to be invited to do something. Throughout, it was very much, well, what do you want to do? Was the question. And for me, that's unprecedented with, a character like Catwoman or Batman. Like you don't get that opportunity very often. And so, I remember talking with Jock, who was working on Batman One Dark Knight at the same time. And we were just marveling at how, given our experience there, just how open they were to everything that we suggested, that we wanted to do and how we wanted to present things. And, having come off Paper Girls where we had, complete control over that, I was worried as like, what's going to be like, to work at DC again, and it was wonderful, and a very special place. And I hope they keep doing these kinds of books because it's the kind of thing that I think results in, hopefully, comics that are evergreen. It shows potential of the medium. It gives a different look at these characters that you don't necessarily get from the monthly issues.
And it goes back to sort of what we were talking about with the Beware the Creeper, of that a different take on these characters. Yeah. And the thing I like about Black Label is I'm familiar with Catwoman. I've jumped in, jumped out. And I like, the funny thing, the nods to the silly suits that she used to wear, the sort of the orange one. I mean, with the purple one with the tail. And I'm like, wait, that's the one with the crazy boots, right? And it was just basically somebody drawing a naked woman and then painting her purple.
Right.
Is that, I have the basics of that character.
Yes.
And then I can jump in there and read this and enjoy this.
And that's why, I picked Catwoman. When I thought about all the characters, when I was thinking about what to do, I thought, maybe I'll do a Wonder Woman war book. That would be really cool, like a period book set in World War II. Mm-hmm. But then I was like, maybe I need to leave it's too soon for another Wonder Woman project for me,
Too soon.
But then Catwoman, I realized, people know who Catwoman is. They recognize the costumes. Even if you don't recognize the costume, or she's got cat ears, and you know that she's a thief, and that it's in the Batman universe, right? And that's really all you need to know. And so this book was always meant to be something to bring in a reader who just has that level of familiarity with the property, and then also leverage the long publishing history and the fandom, and the readership that has existed for the character as well, to be able to draw on that as history for the character, and to give them a real sense of to use that whole publishing and pop culture history as background, in a way, to make the character feel lived in. I think, right, that's the value. I think the main value of Black Label is being able to make these books for a general audience, but then also appeal to, a hardcore, Wednesday audience as well.
It's after 1:30. I got to let you go. So,
no, if you have more questions, happy to keep going.
What are your plans for next? You've created this approach to comics, of producing comics. Definitely it seems to spin out from your couple years as editor, and obviously with Paper Girls, as you were saying, that you used your experience there to keep that book on track. What's your plans for the future?
I don't have any right now. I have to admit that Catwoman took a lot out of me.
It seemed like, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, it feels like how you described it and just everything you did. I was like, how do you recover from something like that? And you were still designing the book in the hardcover. You were involved in that. I mean, where do you, as a creator, because we've talked about that too, is just the physical exertion of drawing and just the physical activity of producing stuff like this.
Yeah,
how do you take care of yourself, and where are you in that?
I don't know. I think I burned myself out a little bit, if I'm going to be honest.
Okay.
The pressure on the self-imposed pressure of the project, and me wanting to be as good as I could possibly make it. This is very much an artistic statement, and a proof of concept, in a way that, like, I've learned all these different things about comics over the years. Can I put them into practice? So there's a lot of pressure on me, to make sure I got it right. And then on top of that, just the pandemic, I think, changed the way my brain works a little bit. Just the added stress every day of, like, just trying to assess threats. There's a part of your brain that's always engaged with that. So I've lost that part, to making comics. And then, as I was working on the last issue, my mom had a stroke. And so I was having to take care of her, and I didn't work for a couple months, as well, as while we were trying to figure out what her situation is. And so finishing the issue was, like I was saying before, it was an anchor for me, but it was exhausting. And I knew at this point I couldn't drop it, and I needed to get it done, and I needed it for it to be good. I needed it to be something that I could proudly point to, and not say, oh, well, yeah, that page I kind of, I did that one a little fast because I had to get to the hospital, I didn't want any reminders of that in the book, which meant working at a level of kind of being meticulous, maybe, kind of misplaced perfectionism, just so that I wouldn't have any regrets looking back at the book. I have enough already on any work that I do, but I didn't want, what had happened to my mom to actually, to then affect, so much had happened already and affected my life that I didn't want it to affect this as well. So it became a real, an obsession almost, to make sure that this book got done, but I didn't have as many hours in the day to do it anymore, so, like, the schedule kept slipping, and it got to a point where we had to get it out by this day. And luckily it all made it out before the end of the year. But it's hard. And there's a price to be paid for that. I'm lucky that I have the luxury of not needing to jump right into another project. I'm doing a lot of covers these days, and which is a great counterpoint to doing all the storytelling, because now you're just kind of focusing on focusing on craft, on illustration, and the challenges of that, of conveying something in one image. But I'm definitely feeling the itch to do more storytelling again. So I don't see myself doing that for the next year or so, but I want to take some time to figure out what the next project is and not just say jump into. I'm sure they would have been happy to greenlight Lonely City too, but to me that felt like maybe not the most courageous choice, or that, that if I could afford it, that I should take some time to figure out what's the next thing. So I'm still in the process.
It almost sounds like a monthly book would be easier for you, but also greenlighting and jumping right back into that in Lonely City, and especially if it's the same process. I mean, I agree with you. What for? What are the, what is this for me as a creator? What am I doing not only for myself, but for my audience here? It's a
different kind of comic. Comics don't all need to be made the same way.
Yeah, exactly.
And I really appreciated the longer timeline, the thought, the luxury of being able to consider things and change my mind about things and take all the care that I needed to with the book. It felt to me like making the amount of time it takes to make like a nice distilled whiskey or something, versus something that's faster and more run and gun and more more garage band punk rock kind of feeling that you get from a monthly comic, where it's just, let's put it out, let's keep putting it out, whatever you did last month, that's done, on to the next thing. It's like it's an album. Just keep putting out singles,
Yep.
And see what you have at the end of the day, versus like this longer symphonic piece. One's not better than the other, and they require different things of you. And having done the monthly thing for a while, like, this was a nice change of pace, but it always feels, this and Greendale, that I did for Vertigo, like, there were longer pieces, and they take it's a different part of your brain. And I'm now that I've done it twice, I'm aware of the difference between that and doing a monthly comic. So jumping into another one was not the first thing I wanted to do, but I definitely do want to do it again.
And there are different experiences for the readers too.
Yeah, absolutely.
With how you generate, a comic, every monthly is like a baseball game, a baseball season. You can't focus on what happened yesterday. You have to focus on what's going on. And then eventually we're in the World Series. But, in your book, Lonely City, it's the same. It's definitely a different experience. I read it differently than what I would do the monthly books that I have right next to me.
Right. So, it's a $7 book. Like, I want people to feel that there's something, I mean, they used to call those projects prestige projects, right? With the, the perfect bound books and everything. You want to give something that it gives it a reason to not be a saddle stitched comic that comes out every month. Like, there has to be something in it that justifies that price, it justifies the experience and the presentation, that's why I did the book that way. But I wouldn't want to do a monthly comic that way. It wouldn't be possible. And then it also, you lose the kind of immediacy of that, and then almost the call and response feel of monthly comics.
I think maybe with the experience you've had twice that you've done this now, maybe there is a way of looking back and figuring out how do you protect yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What
can I take from this experience and then apply to the monthly, to make that feel, is there a hybrid of this that could happen? Or, and then also, how,
if you could jump back into that pool, how do you protect yourself so you come out of it not with this point of exhaustion of like, do I ever want to do that again? That I know how to do this and get to that spot that you were trying to get to with, a Black Label book like this.
I mean, to take it back to the original topic, I remember when I left DC as an editor that consistently, I don't know if I've ever talked to an editor that didn't have these, you would have these kind of panic dreams about whether you put a book into production, or if you forgot the note, and then the book is going to go out. Did you check the blue lines and did you find every mistake, or is some embarrassing typo going to make it through? You know, and I would wake up in the middle of the night being like, did I put that book in? Did I bring it down? I think I brought it down. I'm pretty sure. And you wouldn't know, and you'd have to kind of sit and, you know, until you went into the office to double check. And I had those nightmares for a few months, you know, not, I mean, nightmares is strong, but like I would have those kind of panic dreams, you know, every week or two, you know, for a few months, because your body kind of gets used to that level, you know. And it's the same thing with this, where, you know, it's like, yeah, this is how I made comics for a few years, you know, step away from that and try and find another way to do it. What's a smarter way to do it? What's a better, healthier way to do it?
Or if you just don't like it, go back to, you know, find a different approach. Really.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, that is the challenge, I think, you know, trying to find, you know, and keep it fresh. You know, I definitely don't want to keep doing things the same way over and over. Maybe there's a less tortured way of working.
Well, I got to get to work. I'm going to let you go. Hopefully we won't be so tortured, but I've had those same dreams too, about editing, about waking up and like, did I just send out this typo, this massive typo into the world? Shit. You know, like,
Yeah.
So, but, Cliff, it was great talking to you. Great, you know, getting the whole experience, hearing about how you got to Catwoman Lonely City. I think it's a great book. Everybody should check it out. It's definitely the hardcover, because you even did more work on that too, at least the direct market hardcover. You know, you did even more work for us. So thank you very much for bringing this into the world, and looking forward to what you do next.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll be talking to you later. Take care.
All right.
See you.